thank you so much for joining me. I'm Nola Simon. I'm the host of the Hybrid Remote Center of Excellence. And today I have somebody I know from LinkedIn. We haven't necessarily spoken that much. His name is Jeppe Hansguard. Am I pronouncing that correctly? Even close?
You're doing fine. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. He's very relaxed and very approachable. So far, that's a good indicator that we're going to have a good conversation. The reason that I asked him to be on the podcast is he's the CEO of Innovisor. Is that correct? And it's based in network science, the work that he does. And it's really about identifying the people who have the most influence in your organization and how that can supercharge change, because chances are the people who actually have the most influence in your organization are not your high performers. They're not your executives. They're not the people that you would expect to have that type of influence. And I think that's fascinating because it honestly mirrors a lot of my own experience. So that's the reason that I asked Jeppe to join. I'm actually reading one of his books right now. It's called The Change Fiasco. And he tells a story about his own organization where he had actually tried to identify who had the most influence in his own organization. And can you tell us that story?
I'm just trying to remember now which story is it that I'm telling, because I've been telling so many stories in that.
Oh,
you
had
Is it
identified.
about the first time I wrote? I actually mapped the influence inside an organization, which was a professional services organization. I was heading with about 35 people.
Yeah.
It's that one. I'm okay.
It
so
is,
now
yeah.
I'm with you. Good. Yeah. So I was mapping this one. It was my very first experience with kind of doing this type of analysis. And I got two surprises in the data. The first one actually made me a bit angry because there was one person that I had hired in to grow the competencies and skills of all the young consultants in our unit. But he was just sitting in the periphery. He was only having one connection into the network of people, and that was to me. And that was not the place where I wanted him to be. But then I realized it was probably my own fault because he had been sent off by me on a 12-month project, full-time with a client back in the days when you had to be on site. So he had no chance whatsoever really to build any connections to his colleagues. So there was a reason why he was on the outside. Another thing I discovered was that there was this woman, she's about 35 years, or was about 35 years old. And she was just the most well-connected person in the unit. She was just a glue. If we removed her from the organization, this was back in 2005, if we removed her from the organization, then everything would just fall apart.
Yeah, and you actually quote a stat there. It's basically if the person that you found to be most connected actually leave, it increases the chance that everybody else leaves 500%.
That's something we've seen from our other research, right? Back then, I didn't know. It was just intuitively. If that person is not here anymore, then everybody else will be leaving. Later on, we actually said we want to understand the impact of those key people. What happens if they're not there anymore? And so we measured over time, longitudinal. And what we discovered was that if those really connected people, they leave, then the probabilities of others that are connected to them, that they are also leaving, increases by up to 500%.
Yeah.
And that's a massive number.
That is massive. But the funny thing is, I've seen this play out. I actually worked for an organization where they brought in a new CEO, and it was a legacy insurance organization, right? Like very stuck in their ways. And there were a lot of people who were resistant to change. And so the brilliant idea that they had was they would actually offer like an early retirement package because they couldn't get people to work with them because they were stuck in that mindset of this is the way we've always done it. The idea was if we get rid of the stick in the muds who are creating all the obstacles and the resistance to change, then we'll be able to do the change. The problem was all the people that actually signed up for this early retirement package were some of the most knowledgeable, connected people in the organization. And it really impacted the ability of the organization to get things done afterwards because it interrupted the informal networks that people didn't even really understand.
No, and I think I'm sharing another case in that book where we're working with an HR leader. She's leading a unit of 500 people. And we're debriefing her on how the influence is running inside that unit. And there's one person that's connecting everyone in the organization. And I remember her name really clearly. Her name was Gloria. So I prepared for that meeting. And when the HR director said, "So who is that person?" And I said, "It's Gloria." We just see her looking up the name on the company internet. And then suddenly she just turned pale because Gloria had just been terminated. And you know what happens if then that happens, right? Then the performance dropped pretty quickly because Gloria was the go-to person for a lot of things. Plus, you risk that a lot of other people will be starting to leave.
Because a
And
lot of
that's
times
the kind
people
of
stay
things
for the
you will
people.
experience. Pardon me?
A lot of times people stay because of the, like what you described, the glue, the relationships, the people that notice them and really pay attention to them. And I've found the informal connectors are the people who actually really prioritize the people aspects of their work. Have you found that to be true?
So I cannot categorize the personalities of those people that are influential or the connecting ones. I do think it is people that are sympathetic, that are trustworthy, and that are helpful. So those three things are the things that go again and again in our work.
Yeah, but you actually illustrated that they do tend to be introverts rather than extroverts.
Yeah, so there are some misconceptions about who has the most influence in an organization, right? And we do believe it must be people high up in the hierarchy. It must be the high performers. It must be the tenured people, and it must be the extroverts, right? The ones that are shouting out at the town hall meetings. And nothing can be further from the truth. We actually see the opposite. It's not the tenured people. It's not the leaders. It's not the high performers. And it's not the extroverts. It's more introverts actually. And I think actually one of the worst things you can do is actually name someone a talent or a high performer and make it
Yes.
public. Because if you do that, then they will immediately have less influence in the informal networks.
Yeah, I
It's an
found
us
that.
and them dilemma. That if you can just see it in the schoolyard, if you have kids, it's the same thing.
Yeah, exactly, because other people resent them and they start to leave them out because they feel like they're getting
And can we
special
share
treatment.
information with them because they might be talking to the leaders and what have you? It's that is what is going on here, right?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I often tell people that if it was a choice between actual power and influence, I'll pick influence every time. That's my preference.
Yeah, I think
Um,
there's some personality stuff in at play right there, though, because some people will pick power. I would pick influence
yes.
as well, but you do have other personalities.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. So how does that actually reflect in like performance reviews? Like when you discovered that within your own company, you said that you actually took a look at the way that her compensation and her rewards were structured.
Yeah. So a lot of things here, right? In this case, in her case, we needed to look at different matters rather than just billing, as you always look at for consultants and selling. We had to look at the value of being good for the team. And we actually have done something else, not in this respect, but you can read about that in my second book, where we look at, it's called Connectivity is Broken, Now What? Where we've actually assessed sales teams. We've assessed, and this is for a big pharma company, one of the world's biggest. We assessed, I think, 800 sales teams on their performance. And what we discovered was that the teams with about 25 people that had the best cohesion, that were the best connected internally, were the best performing. So having one person being a high performer, like a lone wolf doing whatever he or she could do to get the sales, typically actually pull down the cohesion of the rest of the team. And what we learned or discovered in this case was that having team metrics rather than individual metrics is a much better choice.
Because then they're not going to work by themselves. They're going to work for
They
the benefit
need
of
to
the team.
work as a team.
Yeah.
So that's really the trick. Get people to work together as a team. See performance as a team thing rather than an individual thing. I'm reading this book right now, which is about apparently the greatest NBA season ever, which was in 87 or 88. I just bought it when I was in the USA last time. And what it actually says in that book is that we praise Michael Jordan a lot as being the greatest basketball player of all times. But he would never have been great unless he had this brilliant team surrounding him.
Right.
He
Yeah.
actually had, I think, 5, 6, 7 seasons without being like really great. It was not until the team was in place that he was that good.
Yeah, because a good team will supercharge individual skills.
Yeah,
That's what it seems like. It's interesting.
exactly.
So tell me, you'd written a post recently about how network effects really can help us offset loneliness that occurs with remote work. What are you seeing
Yeah,
there?
that's a big topic here, right? So
It is.
let me give you some background on this one. So when COVID hit, we were, of course, wondering, so how will this impact the networks in the organizations? And what we discovered was that it did, of course, have an impact. What happened was that people, the network shrunk, if you can say that.
Yep.
I can't remember the exact number anymore, but maybe by 30% or something. So they shrunk by 30%, but the really strong connections that people had, they kept them. The ones they got rid of was the weak connections.
Mm.
And as time passed by, those weak connections, they were just left out there in the cold. Nobody reached out to them. Nobody asked them, invite them in for chit chat or whatever. So you get that feeling if you're sitting out here as being ignored. And it's that feeling that is actually dangerous when you talk about loneliness, when you're not feeling seen by others. And what we've seen is that actually throughout COVID, right, that number just stayed high. The number of people not being included in the informal networks of the organization, so not being reached out to, as I said, for chit chat or for help and advice or for whatever. And even after COVID, the number is still high. So the effort you need to make if you want to fight this is that you actually need to think about, okay, how can we make sure we get people integrated into the networks? How can we make sure they have not only one connection, but 2 or 3 connections into the organization where they actually feel part of something? This is, by the way, and it's fun. This is actually also something I write about in the second book. It's in the very first chapter, because it's pretty close to my heart. So that thing about making sure you actually have connections is enormously important. And if we look at that group of people that joined the company in the period between March 2020 and September 2020,
Mm.
and a lot of people joined new companies in that period, right?
Right.
If they're still part of that company, what we see in the data is that they're always significantly less integrated into the companies than the people that joined after them. So the people that joined maybe from September 2020 and onwards, they're better integrated, those people, because we learned how to include them and involve them virtually. Whereas the
Right.
ones that joined in the first 6 months, they just not lost, but they're significantly less integrated. So it's always a good, and then the other thing is, as we understood this, we forgot that those people joined in that period. So it's always a good idea to make sure that you reboard those people, make sure they get those connections that you normally get in the early days when you join the company. So who is it that they should talk to in the shadow organizations? Those people that, and everybody knows that they need to reach out to if they want to get something solved.
Yeah, exactly. Now, how does that, their managers obviously know that they exist because they're part of their team. So is
Yeah,
this related to management training that really needs to happen to?
I think I think now we get into leadership styles, right? I think the leadership style for remote is different than when you're just in the office.
Yes.
There's a different way of making sure people feel included.
Right.
You need to make sure you have conversations with people, not only about the professional work, but also about things outside of work.
Yes.
So I think that is the training that leaders need to have. It's not my impression that all leaders do that yet, if I should be honest, but that's what needs to happen. And then there's another thing about making sure that you don't think that onboarding is only happening in the first 14 days when you get introduced to the company and you get a laptop and so forth. This is actually something you need to focus on consistently over time, the relationship development.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's actually interesting. I worked for a company for 16 years and then I changed jobs in 2019. And it was actually interesting because they really did not have an onboarding process for an existing employee. They were really optimized for hiring from the outside. And so
Exactly.
they had no idea really how to work with me, because I walked in there and within 2 weeks I was connected to like 200 people, because I was like using the networks that I already had access to, and I knew how all the systems worked. And they had no concept of how to, and they're like, why are you focusing on connecting with people in Vancouver?
Yeah.
And it's okay, they work for the same organization. We're actually in the same department, even though they're not actually in Ontario. To me, it made logical sense, but to them, they had no concept of why that was even important. And within 6 weeks, I was presenting to the executive team because I was involved in like a whole innovation challenge. So it makes such a difference when you actually know how to connect with people and to use the systems to be able to do that. And you make a point that connection is not necessarily about technology. You can use
No.
technology to really implement it, but understanding how people connect and why they connect is much more powerful. Do you want to talk
Yes,
a little
the
bit about
human
that?
connection. It's really the human connection, right? So I sometimes tell a story about this little thing about being okay with asking for help, for example, right?
Yeah.
A lot of people actually do not dare to ask for help.
Yeah.
So again, if we just take it back to when COVID started, right? If you had newcomers that were fresh out of school, they didn't know how to work in the corporate environment, they had issues. But the other group that actually had some issues was the experts. So an
Mhm.
expert, like a legal expert, a marketing, people that were perceived to be expert, they moved into a new organization. They had serious issues because they didn't ask for help. They were supposed to know about all of these things that were going on in their world, right? But they didn't know the nitty-gritty stuff in the new organization. So they had real challenges. They were probably the ones that had the biggest challenges right after COVID hit, when they moved jobs.
Because if they're asking for help, then their self-identity as an expert
Exactly.
is challenged and jeopardized.
Exactly.
So it's about learning to be vulnerable.
You need to be vulnerable.
Yeah, exactly.
And then the other thing, the human connection, how do you build a human connection? To me, it's a lot about making sure you have fun, making sure you can laugh together, because that builds the connection.
Yeah.
And nothing does that better than laughing. So I just made a post today where I said, make sure you have fun every day, otherwise it's a wasted day. I actually
That's
do believe
actually,
that.
yeah, that's actually true. That's actually one thing I miss about going into the office. I have a very loud laugh. I tell people, I'm like, I walk in and the party starts because people will actually turn their heads because they can hear me laughing. And I miss that physical aspect of seeing that reaction, that people realize that I'm there and that I belong.
Yeah.
Right.
But I do think you can create that virtually, but it really takes intention.
Yeah.
Um, And for me, it means that when I talk to the team, I make sure that I talk to every single one in the team. When we have a check-in every morning at
Yep.
9,
Hmm.
and on Fridays we have a checkout.
Okay. Yeah.
And the Friday checkout is always social and more fun, whereas the check-in is more like, okay, what is on the agenda today? But to make sure that everybody feels seen, and that is really important to me.
And how big is your team?
The 12 people.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. How do you how do you scale that as an organization? So like the organization I worked for was like 40,000. Obviously that has to be done at the team level, right? You've got multiple managers, multiple leaders.
I think you need to work at the microculture level, which is those 20 to 25 people maximum.
Okay.
There's another good research on this. There's a guy from Scotland. His name is Dunbar, who refers back to the brain size of monkeys and stuff.
Right.
And
150, the Dunbar
we
number.
have those 150 relationships that we can keep meaningful relations to, right? But we cannot keep meaningful relationships to 150. We really want to have deep conversation. Then it's less.
Right.
Then you're probably more likely to be in the 15 to 20 people. And I think that's where you need to define your microcultures and let
Mm.
those conversations happen. And then you need to find some kind of alignment in between, making sure that the teams move in the same direction, But that's where you need to do it, and you need to make sure that you trust those people that are then facilitating it at that level.
Right. Now, how does this also play into diversity? So you mentioned alignment. So if you've got a global organization, you're hiring all over the world, and you've got the benefit of diversity, how do you apply the network? And how does that improve diversity?
Oh, let me just again roll this one a bit back. Again, in the second book, and I'm really sorry I'm referring to the second book.
That's okay. I do have that on my Kindle. I don't think I've...
Okay, so again, it's called Connectivity is Broken Now What? One of the big breakthroughs for Innovisor 10, 12 years ago was that I was reading an article on a plane from Frankfurt in Germany to Vietnam. And it was about that if you had higher levels of oxytocin in your body, then you would be more collaborative. Oxytocin is the female caretaker hormone.
Mm.
And I thought, okay, this is interesting. We can actually prove if this is the way it also looks in organizations. Because we had all this data about collaboration and how people connected to each other, right? We just didn't have gender data. So I asked one of my young consultants, her name is Ina, I say thank you in the book as well, if she could just go through all the names and just make an extra column and then just add, okay, so Jeppe is a man, Nola is a woman, and so forth, right? And we got all of that data, right? And then she came into me and said, I'm not sure if this is a good conclusion, but men and women are collaborating with the same number of people. So I think it was 8.6 people on a daily basis or 8.7, right? So it was just the same. That's not a good story, really, right? So then I said, okay, but is there anything in who they're collaborating with? And she went back and she mined the data and so forth. And then she came back to me again and said, here's actually an interesting thing. So if we remove all the biases about hierarchy and function and all of that stuff, men are actually 40% more likely to collaborate with men. And women are 40% more likely to connect with women. So there's a gender bias. Okay, I thought this is actually a pretty good story. Let's see how we can get that into world media, right? So we pitched it to Wall Street Journal, and they called me, and I remember that conversational phone interview while I was driving my kids to track and field. That
The
I was talking
ultimate
to the
remote
journalist.
work.
I was talking to the journalist from Wall Street Journal, and then a couple of days later, it came into a Wall Street Journal where it got picked up by the CEO of Facebook, Sheryl Sandberg. Then took the article, included it into her book, Lean In.
Oh, you were included in Lean In?
Yeah, I think it's on page 155, right?
Oh, it should have been on 150.
And then it exploded from there, right? Now here, I think it was last year, we checked in on it again because it was approximately 10 years after.
Right.
And you would think that, okay, after 10 years of Lean In and initiatives and all of that stuff, things would have changed. A lot of people have been earning a lot of money on D&I and what have you.
Yeah.
But nothing has changed. It's exactly the same numbers.
So why do you think that is?
I think that is the way it is because people think they know and they forget to bring the data in. I think if people get the data before they start to act, become more intentional about how they work with for example, staffing of teams or whatever.
Yeah.
Then if they don't do that, then it will just stay the same.
That's interesting.
And then the case I shared with you here from, I think it was yesterday, which was from an engineering company where we were doing we focused in or zoomed in on the leadership team, which had, I think, about 100 people or so. And it was looking good on connectivity side. But then we just added a layer on top of that, a layer of information, which was gender. And immediately we could see that something was wrong. First of all, they had very few women in the leadership team, and they knew that already, 13%. They knew they wanted to grow that, but the women were not included. They were not asked for help and advice if anything happened. They were basically ignored the first time. So they knew they had to change that, the culture, right? So in the second time we checked in on them, they had grown the number of women, I think, to 21% in the top leadership team. But the good side of it was that there was no bias at all in picking your collaborative partners.
Oh, that's
So
interesting.
0%. So they moved from having a very big bias, I think it was about 50%, to 0%, while growing the share of women in the top leadership team by 50% as well.
And how long had lapsed? Like how
2
much
years.
time? 2 years? Okay.
Yeah. And I don't think they're not done yet. What they
Mm,
really need to get to is that they need to get a gender representation. To me, they need to get above 30% women, because when you are above 30%, you don't have the same majority feeling anymore.
okay.
So that's actually an important milestone to get to. And that's what they're working on right now. But they need, while they grow the number of women, they need to keep that culture, that unbiased culture. That's really the key to the inclusion part.
And how did they make the change? Like you mentioned intention, like they're intentionally committed to do that, but did they create key performance indicators and goals and metrics associated with that, or how did they do it?
You can see for the recruiting, they are of course intentional on who are they recruiting into the company, right? And who are they moving up through the ranks. So that's the first thing. The second thing they do is that they actually make this visible to people. So by making it visible to people that we're actually looking at this and we know that you have a bias and we can see it's like this high,
Yep.
you actually make people aware that they shouldn't have the bias. And that if they don't do anything about it, they will have to defend their bias afterwards. So you make it more likely for them, or they're more aware that they need to consider it every single time they make a decision.
And did they
A
also look
very
at,
small practice that they actually changed was that every single time they got together in the top 100, right? They went off to some fancy offsite with
right,
a hotel somewhere, right? And normally when the meetings were done, all the men would meet in the lobby bar to watch some sports. And then the 11% or 13% of women, they would sit there and think, okay, this is not really for us, right? So they needed to find a different type of entertainment, which was more inclusive, for example, just to make sure that they didn't exclude them by the activities. That's just one example.
yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And I've seen that too. Did they also look at pay equity as
No,
part of that process as well too?
no.
So why not? Just curious. Or is that a whole rabbit hole?
I don't know the explanation for that. I stick to my part of it, which is about the organizational leadership. I didn't get involved in that part.
Okay, just curious. So I have a question for you. So once you've actually understood like informal networks at an organization level and also as a personal level, and you decide to leave, how do you actually pivot your networks and connect them? Because that's actually a question I have personally for you. And I don't know if this is something that you feel comfortable answering, but I worked for an organization for 17 and a half years. I find that my network is very centric on that organization still, and best efforts I'm trying to pivot and whatnot. But are there blind spots that people have when they're trying to expand their networks and shift
There's a
into
limit to how big your network is, right? So you need to reconsider who should be in your network. Who is it you want to stay in contact with? What are they giving you?
Yeah.
And I think that's where you have to be a bit harsher, right?
I spend a lot of time actually blocking and unfollowing.
Yeah, no, but I'm not saying that you need to unfollow, but I'm just saying, okay, maybe you don't need to talk to them, right? And I got a few rules for myself, and that is I always take the first call if someone reaches out.
Yep.
Always.
Yep.
That's my rule. You never know what happens, right? I don't take a second call unless I can see the value in it.
Ah, interesting.
Never. And that is never. I don't do that. And
Right.
that is to protect myself. And in the same way, you can also say on social media, I am pretty active on social media. I publish what I think and write articles and stuff like that. If I see people are doing some self-promotion on my articles or posts, I ignore them. I
Yeah.
don't care. So I ignore, or I stop after one conversation, basically, right? And so that's my filter. And then if you look at the connection from the past, you have this thing called give and take, and you've probably heard about it
Yes.
before. Givers and takers.
Yes. That's actually one of the first things that actually helped me pivot when I actually changed jobs after 16 years was that talk by Adam Grant.
Yeah. So the givers and takers, just for the listeners here, is the givers always come out on top for performance,
Yeah.
but they always also come out at the bottom for performance. And the difference between the people that go out on the top and the difference, or then the people that get out at the bottom, is that the ones at the top, they know when to protect themselves and say no.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not that you
Boundaries are
shouldn't
important.
give, because I do think you should, but you need to protect yourself.
Yeah.
Because you do have takers, right? And they will take, and they will take, and they will take again and again. And they might even copy your IP or your thinking, and they will not thank you afterwards, right? They will just do it, and that happens.
Right.
So just make sure you protect yourself. I think that's the biggest message I can come with in this sense.
Yeah, no, boundaries are really important. And I sense that as well too. So I feel grateful because obviously we've been giving and taking and you continue to talk to me. So obviously we're doing well enough with there and you're here today. So
No, I enjoy this.
yeah, no, I enjoy it as well too. And I think it's such important work because before we actually started recording, you really should start recording because this is important. But we were talking actually about AI. One of the first podcasts that I did was actually about using AI to actually identify skills that people didn't actually realize that existed within their organizations. And I asked if there's an opportunity to pair the AI work that they're doing on skills with informal networks. And I haven't seen anybody talk about that combination. Have you?
I think we were doing AI before it was even known that something was called AI. Again, if I go back to the story here, right? So our field has really changed, and how can we help the company succeed with change? I think it was 6 years ago, we got a huge investment from the Danish Innovation Fund to develop ourselves into that area, into that field.
Okay.
And we started growing. And I should also say that we have a technology university in Denmark that is an expert, they're world experts in this as well. So we collaborated with them on this. We built our knowledge database with all the clients we worked with over the years. And we came to that point where we could answer this question. What is our likelihood or probability of succeeding with change? And I was happy. I thought, okay, that's really brilliant. Now we can say you have a 67% likelihood of succeeding with change.
Right.
But the follow-up question from the CEO would, of course, be, okay, but what should I do about it? How do I prove the 67% to 82%, for example, or 100% if that is possible, right? So I actually need to figure out what were the interventions. So we went from predictive intelligence to prescriptive intelligence. And that's what we've been working on. And this is really what the coolest AI, in my view, is. We can actually tell a leader exactly who to work with, about what, and when to succeed with change.
And that's where the 3% comes
See,
from?
the 3% are in this, but it's not the only thing. So one of the things we discovered in the work, as we mined the data and we trained the data here, the models, was that we have 6 change blockers that are repeating themselves every single time we face a change program. And those 6 change blockers, the first, and that's the third book I'm writing on right now, I can tell you. The first one is the cohesion of the leadership team.
Okay.
It's typically ignored in change programs because it's outside the scope of your work, right? But
Right.
if your leadership team is not working together as one and speaking as one on the change program that you are about to drive or grow, you would fail. So this is actually something you need to focus on. So that's number one. The second thing is something I call network fragmentation. So how connected is the company? Or as in most cases, how disconnected is it? Do you have silos? Do you have, yeah, you know what I'm talking about, right?
I totally do.
And all companies have that, right? And if you have silos, then that means your intervention needs to be different because you need to get into every single one of those silos
Right.
to turn it around. So that's number two. Number three is really about the perceptions of 2 key stakeholder groups, which is the 3%. So we have a group of employees, 3%, that typically impact around 90% of their colleagues. Those informal catalysts we talked about before, right? that group of people is extremely important, but the leaders are also important, and they both have to be positive for you to succeed. Because if they're working against you, then you can forget it, right? So they're like an early warning signal for what you're trying to achieve.
Like the canary in the coal mine.
Pardon me?
The canary in the coal mine.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the fourth one is the organizational commitment. So you've got the entire organization. Do they really like your organization, or do they not? Right? Are they indifferent? If they're indifferent, they're not really going to do any extra effort on your change program. You want people to be committed to you.
Right.
So that's the fourth one. The fifth one is the ongoing leadership attention to what you're trying to do. So it's not enough to have the attention when you launch your program. You actually need to have the attention over time, because things change and you need them on board, right? And the sixth one is the project team. Do you have a project team that is set up for success? Or, as in cases, many of the cases we see, you have a project team that is suddenly just being set up, but you never think about it. So do they have the right skills and capabilities in place really to drive this forward?
Yeah. And a big part of it too is the urgency of the change, the urgency of the change, and how much priority it seems that the organization has for the change to happen.
Yeah, exactly. And then the organization will see it if it's not prioritized by the leaders, right? It's so evident that if there's no role modeling, and then why should we change as an organization?
Yeah. And I don't think that executives really understand that enough. So, yeah. Yeah, that was the change blockers was where I was heading next. So thank you for bringing me that.
Yeah, but in that respect, so you can feed this into our models.
Yeah.
And then you can discover a lot of things, and you can probably also discover something about skills. I do not have the skills data, but it's easy to do. So
it is easy to do. You can add it to your roadmap.
Yeah, but it's like adding the gender to the data when we looked at, when we wrote the article for Linear. It's the same thing.
Yeah. So where do you go next with your networking information? What's the possibility for the future? Where do you see 5-10 years from now the work going?
Where we go right now is that we want to make sure this is in front of as many change leaders and executives as possible, because I actually do think there's so much bad change out there. And it is really, and this is my lonely war here, right? It's horrifying to me that how many employees are actually exposed to poor change management.
Yeah.
And I think that is what I'm working on. We're trying to make something that is so accessible and impossible to ignore for leaders and change professionals, so they will work with it.
That's a very big goal.
It is a very big goal, and I remember when I was trying to pitch it at an investor thing here, everybody was looking at me and shaking their heads, but we have moved so far, and I actually want to say in the last 3 months, so from January 1st until March 31st, we've been piloting, and we have a proof of concept on it, and now just last week, I was starting to push this out to other organizations. So cool. We are there where we can deliver this, and also in a very short time. Normally, we can deliver it so fast that organizations cannot follow. So from the day you decide to work with us until we're done, it takes down to a week, and then we tell you who and when and how and all of that stuff.
Wow.
And it doesn't matter if you're 40,000 people or if you are 200.
I was just going to ask that. Is there a difference?
No. Yeah, there's a difference in the pricing, but no, there's no difference.
Oh, interesting.
The biggest organization we've done this with is 200,000 people.
And did it help them with their change?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The only issue is that if you do this with 200,000 people, you should be aware what requirements does this put on your project team afterwards.
Yeah.
Because now you got all that data, right? Then you need to act on it.
Right.
So you know the who, you know the what, the how, but do you have people that can engage with them? And then what we often see is then they call in the big 5 consultants.
Yes. Because the perception is they alone have the skills and capability to handle something that
I think it's not even that. I think it's just the resources available to do something on the side.
Yeah.
But I can tell you, our data is pretty clear on that as well. That intervention is not helping you succeed with change.
Bringing in the big five.
Bring in the consultants to do the work for you, to do the
I
dirty
see.
work. It's much better to bring in experts, like one-man bands or two-man bands as experts. If you bring in like a wagon full of consultants, you're not going to succeed anyways, because how would that be perceived by the employees, right? They know you're not doing the work yourself. It's poor role modeling.
That's interesting too. And they're outside the informal networks.
They're outside the informal networks.
Yeah.
They might build their own informal networks to each other. We've also assessed that once or twice, actually, where we looked at see, this was in the Middle East, right? So it was an energy company, 1,000 people, and then they have brought in 150 consultants to do something for them.
Wow.
But the 150 consultants, what did they do, right? They were just creating their own little silo inside the organization. They connected to each other. They were probably having dinner with each other in the evenings, and their families were connecting to each other while they were doing stuff. Right, they were there for 6-7 months in that Middle Eastern place, and it provided a risk to the company, right? Because what happens when they leave? There's nobody there to take over. There's no knowledge transfer, nothing at all.
Yeah,
Plus, everybody else has been sitting there looking at them, thinking, okay, so this project that you're talking about, and this was about it was a matrix organization that was implemented here in this case, right? This organization that you implemented is so important to you that you bring in 150 consultants from the outside to do the work for you. That's the message you're sending, right? And that doesn't work.
Yeah. Interesting. So is there anything that you hope changes or improves? Is there, like, what's your wildest dream?
So what I hope changes is that leaders, I was actually also making a tweet earlier today where I was just saying, it seems to me that people over time, so when I joined the workforce, I learned stuff. And I learned, okay, so it's not like in the textbooks, actually, I need to work with people and all of that stuff. And a lot of other people in my age, they have learned it in the same way, that it's the only way forward. But then we get new leaders coming in, new young people growing into the leadership ranks. And to me, it seems they're doing the same mistakes as we did 20 years ago, 20 to 25 years ago, right? And they repeat the same mistakes. So we have books that are written by people like Gary Hamel or...
Okay, yeah.
What's the other name? There's a guy who wrote this book about excellence. What's his name? Oh, never mind. But the guy who just wrote a book about the friction project, also from Stanford.
Oh, Bob Sutton, yeah.
Bob Sutton. So it's Gary Hamel, Bob Sutton, and then there's another guy who's 80 by now, right? But they've been writing about this for years, right? And people read the books, and they go to the talks and they listen to them. But somehow it doesn't really result in changes in the way they lead. And I think that is my hope, that one day people will listen to those people and actually start to change the way they act in organizations.
Yeah.
You asked me another question up front. So are people listening more to this? And I normally say that it's about 50% of leaders that are willing to listen to this.
Oh, yeah. Are executives and CEOs resistant to the messaging? That's the question I asked, right?
I think 50% are okay with listening to this and will do stuff. And then you got the other 50% and they will never listen to it.
Because they think they know better?
They know it all. It's the know-it-alls.
Yeah, we want the learn-it-alls.
Yeah. So I was talking to a HR director from a company with 5,000 employees. And we talked about these influential people that nobody has ever guessed who were, right? And I was getting into like the sales part of it and saying, okay, we would just do this and that, and then you will have the names and in this time. And he said, yeah, but you don't need to tell me this. I already know who those people are in my 5,000 people organization spread across 5 continents in 20 different offices. And there's no way he's going to know that.
Yeah.
But in that person, you cannot sell it. I cannot sell anything. I cannot convince to look at the networks. You need a person that is aware that they don't know.
And how do you work around those people?
I just skip them. I don't work with them.
You don't work with them at all. Okay.
I don't see. It's like the give and take. I don't see any reason why I should invest time in that.
It's better to actually, you're going to make more progress with the people who believe.
Yeah. So it's a prioritization again, right? Where do I see the most value of my time?
Yeah, there's no point in trying to convince people who just aren't going to see.
No.
Yeah, that's interesting. I love that you brought up Bob Sutton. He's actually on my list of people I would love to interview.
So when I took my certificate at Stanford, I was meeting Bob Sutton and the other guy. His name was Jeffrey Pfeffer.
Okay.
And they were speaking. I've listened to him twice for 2 hours, and I think he's so inspiring. That's a strong recommendation there to just listen to him because he's just good.
Yeah, no,
and fun.
And he's
By the way,
funny.
fun. Yeah, he's fun.
Yeah, he's funny. Yeah, that's very good. Cool. I will make sure in the show notes we've got your bio and your website and LinkedIn and all of that stuff. Is there anything else you'd like me to point to?
No, that's fine.
Just want
I think
people to
I'm
be able
pretty
to
open on
find you.
LinkedIn and Twitter, so people can find me there. That's all good.
Okay, perfect. I will make sure that they're there. So thank you for all the work that you do with networking and network science and just surfacing the value of the people who are those informal connectors, because I personally think those are the most important people in your organization.
Yeah, you're not going to succeed without them, at least.
You're not at all.
So that's pretty easy.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. So, thank you so much. And I'm just
It was
going to.
great meeting you.
Great meeting you. So.
Thank you.